Sorry, just bear with me for 1 minute. I don't know what's happening with this. Okay, we're good to go now. All right, so yeah, great to be here to talk to you all today. So what I'm going to be talking about is actually a small study that is part of TBI Bank. And what we were looking at in this study was actually at the lived experience of communication recovery. So this was a project that I undertook with Professor Leanne Torr, who's also here at the University of Sydney with me, Sophie Brassel, who is a PhD student at Sydney too, and Joanne Steele, who is at the University of Newcastle, which is in not far from Sydney, for those of you who don't know the area very well. And it's probably about a few hour drive from Sydney. So we all work fairly closely together. So a little bit of background, and again, I'm not sort of sure how much background everyone has, so do excuse me if I am providing a little bit more background. But I just wanted to go back and just highlight that people with severe traumatic brain injury, do have really poor outcomes. An example of some recent research that has been published found that 51% of people with a severe TBI were unemployed at 8 years. And of those people, the ones who were employed, so the 49%, 38% of them had a reduced salary. The outcomes for TBI are not only in relation to employment, but we also know that there are poor outcomes for relationships, for independence, and across a real wide range of areas. In general, rehabilitation outcomes can be quite poor. What we also know is that cognitive communication impairments can account for a lot of that variance in psychosocial outcomes, and we're building more and more evidence all the time about the link between communication and psychosocial outcomes. And there's certainly a good body of work building up that evidence. One of the core issues that we have when working with communication disorders in particular is difficulties with rehabilitation engagement. So we know that's a real known problem with this population. And we also know that that does predict functional outcomes. And so, from working in my clinical experience with people with TBI, I knew that this was a really core issue of engagement. How do we keep people engaged in therapy, and support them to really engage with that process? One of the areas where I thought research was really lacking was actually getting insight into how adults with TBI actually experience, like what is their experience of cognitive communication recovery. So there's a real lack of research into understanding the perspectives of people with TBI. In the field of TBI, more broadly outside of communication, there has been a bit more research, but certainly not in relation to cognitive communication. And yet what we know is that user perspectives are really core to offering patient-centered care. And there is this link to engagement, and potentially looking at the lived experience of these people may help us to find potential avenues for engagement. So that led me to the current study that we developed here, where the aim was to provide an understanding of the lived experience of communication recovery after severe TBI. And we wanted to look at that over time. So we wanted to look at it from acute to post-acute care. So, sorry, let me just, can I just change my view here? No. Sorry, I'm just trying to see a few people here. Okay, so the study design that we used here was a qualitative design, and we had structured discourse samples that were taken from the TBI Bank protocol. And we had 3 key data points. So we had 6 months post-injury, 1 year, and then we had 2 years post-injury. And so we were able to recruit 12 participants from the TBI Bank database for this particular study. So for this study, we actually wanted to ensure that they had all data points. So the tall corpora that I've indicated there is actually a much larger corpora of data. There are 58 participants in the larger corpora, but for this one, we wanted people who had this particular data on their lived experience at each of the data points, and we didn't want any missing data. We also wanted to exclude people with aphasia and dysarthria, the severe dysarthria, sorry. Mainly the people with aphasia were excluded because we have found that they have a different recovery trajectory, and we're actually doing some research looking at them as a separate group. And there was one participant who had a really severe dysarthria who the output was so unintelligible we weren't able to actually obtain the content from it. And so our data collection was looking at a few of the tasks within the TBI Bank protocol, which are on my next slide. And then we did a qualitative thematic analysis of that content. So we selected 3 of the tasks within the TBI Bank protocol stimuli. So the TBI Bank protocol, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is a discourse protocol that contains a number of different genres and tasks. It's freely available, and there are a range of different resources available for it, such as picture description stimuli, and a range of different tasks, such as an important event to retell, a procedure. And what we've got here is the free speech component of it, where we asked people to talk about 3 core areas. So the first one was about communication, and we said, I'm going to be asking you to do some talking. How do you think your speech is these days? So we kept it quite in lay terms for people, and there were levels of prompting for each of these for each of the stimuli. So you provide the initial prompt, and then if the person doesn't respond within 10 seconds, there are different levels of prompting that you can provide to help elicit a more substantial response from the patient. The second part of it was encouraging the participant to talk about their illness narrative. So we said, tell me what you remember about when you had your brain injury. And then the final question was, tell me about your recovery. What kinds of things have you done to try to get better since your brain injury? Now, I actually collected a lot of the initial data from the cohort about this, and I just thought there was such rich and interesting data in that I really wanted to pull this out for this particular study. So I guess one of the things just to point out here is that because we did use the TBI Bank protocol, there wasn't as much opportunity for people to, for it to be a bit more like a semi-structured interview or an unstructured interview format. So we did sort of follow that protocol quite strictly there. However, we did encourage people to produce a full response. So the qualitative thematic analysis was an iterative approach. So we went through the steps indicated by Braun and Clark. We had initial familiarization with the data set. We generated some codes by looking at what were the meanings that were coming out. We looked at these themes across the data set. And then as a team, we reviewed those potential themes and sub-themes. We defined and named them, and then we produced the report, which we'll be talking about. So what were the results overall? So there were 3 core themes that came out. There was this theme of communication recovery is really diverse in people's experiences of that. And there was a real range of the nature of communication challenges that people talked about, and really varied experiences of their recovery as well. There were very varied experiences of the whole recovery journey, not just communication recovery as well. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these components that came out in a bit more detail in the next few slides. And then the final theme that came out was this idea of a continuous and lifelong journey of recovery, which was a really interesting theme that has some really interesting implications for thinking about management of TBI. I'm just going to move my slides down there. So when we pulled out this first theme, and this was predominantly from the question of asking people about their speech, the key things that people were talking about were word finding difficulties in particular. And these wasn't just initially. So this was also up to 1 and 2 years post-injury. These were recurring issues that continued to come up. A similar pattern was found with dysarthria. So people were often still talking about the impact of dysarthria on their communication. There was also often, these idea, and I found it really interesting that people were pulling out their social communication difficulties. So people were often talking about, having difficulties staying on topic in conversation. So this particular participant said, if you let me ramble, then I could go on as well. But if I concentrate on what I'm saying and concentrating on staying on target, I'm pretty right. I don't think I ramble too much, but I could be wrong. And so that was really insightful to really see people pulling out and highlighting that social communication difficulties are perceived as an area of problem by them, because we know that insight and awareness can be a really core problem with this group. Some of the other areas that came out, and one that I was particularly interested in, was also this idea of the impact of fatigue on speech. A lot of people really talked about the impact of it on their speech. And then as you'll see in future slides, it was also a theme in relation to their recovery overall. So fatigue management was a really core issue that was coming out. And I don't think it's an area that's really examined routinely, certainly not here. And it's certainly not something that we have a lot of guide around how to manage it. And memory challenges were the other core area that were highlighted. The other thing I just wanted to point out while we're talking about, these areas that people with TBI highlighted as a priority, is that many of these people actually weren't having therapy. So a lot of these people, so I think, let me check how many it was. At 1 year, only 2 out of 12 of these people were actually having therapy. And that reduced to only 1 person at 2 years. And yet most of them were continuing to report ongoing problems. So we have this, this situation where people are continuing to have problems long term, and yet they're not engaged in any speech pathology service alongside that. So I think it's sort of that mismatch between service delivery and really thinking about, are we, engaging people in that a process where they're able to re-engage back into therapy as required. Moving on to that second theme, where we were sort of getting people to talk about their recovery and rehabilitation more broadly, a couple of the key things that really came out there were the importance of re-engaging with work and also leisure. So a lot of people were really talking about, aiming to get back into the workforce. So we know that that's a really key priority for people, but also thinking about things like leisure activities. And I think this was really interesting in highlighting the range across ICF domains. Like, this was where this was really starting to come out. And I think it has, really strong implications for thinking about, the multidisciplinary nature of the work that we do when we're working with people with a TBI. I will just pause there because I did see a question, a hand up. Was it Julia? I did. Is there a question?
Sorry, that was an accidental hand up, but I was just trying to see the screen a little bit bigger. So my bad. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No worries, Julianne. Thank you. But Elise, we do have a question from Anne-Marie Finley. Would you like me to read that out to you?
I can actually see it there. Thank you. I will read it out. So thank you, Anne-Marie. Did people specifically specify references to fatigue with regards to origin, intensity, duration, etc.? I'm wondering about the effect of general fatigue versus fatigue specific to effort in cognitive processing. That's a really good point. No, I don't really recall people, you know, there weren't really any distinct patterns around that. I think it would be really interesting to look at fatigue in more detail, because I think what you have highlighted there is, you know, that fatigue specific to effort in cognitive processing, I think was one of the areas that did come out a little bit in terms of people saying, you know, when you know, just recognizing the limitations of, you know, when I've been doing a lot, then I end up getting fatigue. So I think, yeah, I think there was a bit more of that discussion about it in relation to effort. But certainly I think some further discussion about that with people with TBI would be of interest. So I think it was one of the areas that we maybe weren't expecting to find in the study, and it really opened up a potential area for further investigation. So thank you. So moving through to the next theme, what we also found was that a lot of people were really wanting to highlight the role of their family and friends in the recovery process. So a lot of people were talking about, you know, their family and friends, the support that they gave. But the interesting part that I found in this was that people often, when they were talking about their illness narrative, they started to embed within their illness narrative the fact that their illness has been impacting on their family and friends as well. And they started to really talk about how their family and friends are, you know, part of their brain injury narrative. So I thought that was really interesting. And again, you know, really highlighted to me the importance of including family and friends in that process of recovery and rehabilitation over time. And we know that there's good evidence for communication partner training, for example. And I think this just, you know, reinforces that here as well. Okay. The other thing that, so this was very a broad theme that came out in relation to recovery and rehabilitation, was that there's, you know, people with the TBI talked about such varied aspects of their multidisciplinary rehab. So again, this concept of fatigue came up, the memory strategies came up again. But they talked about a number of different areas as well, such as the need for things like a gradual return to activities. So that as well may be related to that fatigue component. But they also talked about some interesting aspects of their therapy. So some of them really focused on talking about you know, cognitive-based therapies that they might have been engaging in, or reading-based therapy. And I think, you know, looking at everything that was brought up in terms of recovery and rehab, I think what it really highlights is that there is this really wide range of areas that people with a TBI, you know, that, you know, we can't identify one specific area, but I think it speaks to the fact that we need a multidisciplinary team involved in their management. And, you know, we know that, but I think it's nice to have that reaffirmed here. But also thinking about the ICF domains, I think a lot of this to me was highlighting that people with a TBI are talking about impairment-based difficulties. But if we go back a little bit here, they're talking about their environment, so communication partners. And then if we go back to this this first slide here, they're talking about things like their work and their leisure. So I think, you know, it really speaks to the fact that we need to be thinking about support across all of the ICF domains in our management of patients. And also as part of that that team, so not only within our practice with the patient, but also more broadly. So I found it really interesting that people with a TBI without knowledge of these concepts were actually pulling out, and we were able to identify, you know, these domains in what they were saying and from their perspective. So I was really excited to find that. The last core theme that came out was really a theme about having a continuous and lifelong journey of recovery. People talked a lot in this theme about the idea of hope. So they were saying things like, oh, I was very lucky. I'm just trying to stay positive. And a lot of them were talking about you know, not knowing about how they were going to improve. So I had one participant who at 2 years said, the jury is still out on whether I could continue to improve. So it was this idea of, you know, we don't know if I'm going to continue to improve, but a lot of them were talking about, you know, continuing and trying to improve even beyond that. The other interesting part, so in addition to this concept of hope that came out, there was also a need for independence and agency, which particularly came out around the 2-year time point. So as people were a little bit further along, so this wasn't as prevalent at that initial time point, the 6 month in particular, or the 1 year. A lot of people were saying things like, you know, I like to be as independent as possible. Let me push myself that little bit more instead of holding me back. Another person said, you know, you can't just sit down and do nothing. You have to push yourself a little bit further. It gives you that incentive. So people were talking about challenging themselves and taking ownership and agency of their recovery journey. So I was really excited to see that, and particularly because we're identifying this at that 2-year time point. Often when people aren't getting services, and as I mentioned, a lot of them in this particular cohort were not actually getting services at that point in time. You know, and I think that could be a potential, you know, important area that we could think about in service. You know, maybe people are more ready to engage in therapy by taking more ownership at those later stages of recovery. The final part of this, you know, continuous and lifelong journey was this concept of people also wanting to really take care of themselves. So they were often talking about, you know, wanting to have a healthy lifestyle. A lot of them talked about taking safety precautions in particular. And again, this was more around the later time points. People were, you know, showing a bit more awareness about safety. So they were talking about, you know, I'm really careful when I climb ladders. You know, when I exercise, I make sure that I don't go too hard. So just sort of thinking about their own wellness and safety, which I thought, again, was really interesting for them to be thinking about that, but also, yeah, thinking about just their wellness and well-being. And I guess in terms of engagement, we identified that that could potentially be a theme that people might relate to and could be used as a bit of a therapy, something that, you know, could be used as some therapy stimuli, perhaps like a topic that could perhaps be integrated within therapy programs that might be of interest to people with a TBI, because that was certainly what they were indicating in our study. So I guess just to kind of map out a lot of those themes and what we came up with for this study. So by examining that lived experience of communication recovery, we were able to understand what people with TBI perceive as priorities for their speech pathology rehabilitation, and also potentially some future research needs. So social communication was identified as a priority for people with TBI, but also areas like anomia and dysarthria, and particularly anomia. There's not a lot of research evidence to support treatment around that. So I think that's kind of a core area that really could be researched further. I've also mentioned a bit about fatigue, but certainly thinking about how we manage that in the context of communication and memory for communication as well, I think could be another area where we could do some further research, and certainly think about supporting people with TBI and, you know, how to manage fatigue around their communication. So the other broader findings were that what the people with TBI highlighted was their needs across a range of ICF domains. They highlighted, you know, areas that would indicate the need for a multidisciplinary team. And also we saw that this, you know, occurred over time. So what we would suggest is that service provision is really needed beyond that acute care period. So you know, here looking between 1 and 2 years post-injury, but also potentially beyond that as well. We saw the important role of family and friends being highlighted by people with a TBI, and identified that agency, or you know, wanting to take ownership of their recovery and safety and well-being are, you know, potentially some avenues for helping to engage people. And you know, the illness narrative could be a potentially valuable therapeutic tool. And certainly I think some future research looking at how people with a TBI, you know, develop their illness narrative over time, and also looking at the perspectives of their family members and friends as part of that process. Sorry, child. No, I'm in a meeting.
Mommy jumped on me.
Okay. Sorry, excuse me for one moment. I'm really sorry.
No problem at all.
Got an injured child. One moment.
Yeah,
Not badly.
While we're waiting, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we can discuss all of that later on too. Thank you.
I'm so sorry about that. So as I was saying, yeah, the illness narrative, I think, has a lot of potential. And I think in helping people to develop their identity. And I think that, you know, what we saw is that can potentially change and shift over time. And I think it's interesting that people with a TBI, you know, are thinking about perspectives of family and friends, you know, within their illness narrative over time as well. I did want to highlight just a couple of limitations of our project here. So we did only have a small sample of 12 people, and the elicitation of it with the use of the word speech may, although that was a decision to support lay terminology, you know, we felt that perhaps, you know, the use of the term communication more broadly may have elicited a slightly different response. I mentioned earlier that we used a standard protocol, so we didn't have as much opportunity to, you know, maybe probe in and find out a little bit more detail on particular areas. However, we did allow people to talk as much as they could about each component. And as I mentioned before, we did exclude people with aphasia. However, we are planning to do some research on that group in particular. So that is my wrap up of my talk today on my study about perspectives of people with TBI and communication. So I would love to open the floor up and have some conversation. Love to answer any questions about it, and hear what people have to say.